there are certainly moments when de Gaulle finds Churchill a bit silly. Above all, Churchill admires de Gaulle because he's a romantic, but de Gaulle himself is not a romantic, and he doesn't like Churchill's romanticised view of the world. There's a wonderful moment. Churchill sends de Gaulle a passage from his memoir, or from his history of the Second World War, to comment on, in which Churchill describes de Gaulle's escape from France in 1940. And de Gaulle writes a kind of withering letter saying this is a Romanesque account, a romantic, a novel-like account. And that's obviously disapproval.
Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle were thrown together by a shared interest to defeat the Nazis and protect modern Europe during World War II. But aside from leading their countries, they perhaps had little in common. A new dual biography about the pair, titled The Last Titans, Churchill and de Gaulle, explores how these two extraordinary but very different men joined forces and went on to be perhaps the defining figures of the 20th century. The historian behind the book is Richard Vinen, and I'm very pleased to say he joins me now. Richard, welcome to Times Radio.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being with us. So look, Churchill and de Gaulle, they're two of the most widely discussed and written about figures in history. Why did you feel another book on the pair of them was required?
Partly because putting them together changes one's view of both of them. So they're people who are so extraordinary that they're often seen as if they're kind of, giants in a world of pygmies, and therefore they can only be understood on their own. But these two men, they're very different, but they're kind of comparable. They're people of similar stature, and they're also very shrewd about each other. So just reading about their kind of interaction, reading the things they sent to each other, tells you a lot about them, I think.
So look, their lives began very differently and ended very differently, and we'll talk about both those things in time. But they obviously coincided during the war. What was their relationship like during the war?
Well, it changes very sharply. So Churchill is incredibly gracious to de Gaulle when he first arrives in London. So when he first arrives in London, de Gaulle is nobody. I mean, nobody in England really has heard of him about a week before he arrives finally on the 17th of June, 1940. And Churchill picks him up and recognises him. I mean, doesn't recognise him as the head of government, but recognises him as the leader of the Free French, wherever they are, as he puts it. And he admires de Gaulle's courage, and Churchill's a great romantic. So the kind of romance of de Gaulle's very, very kind of brave, almost eccentric stand appeals to Churchill, I think. As it becomes more and more obvious that other people take de Gaulle seriously, relations cool a bit. So one of Churchill's great things is Churchill loves France, and he sometimes thinks he himself is the best person to represent France. And of course he knows all sorts of French people, some of whom are actually much more important before 1940 than de Gaulle. So Churchill is always thinking about those people. Churchill is also, quite rightly, obviously, concerned to win the war. So he's got this huge, great strategic effort. So he needs to think, how do we not annoy Vichy enough to push them into being fully in the Nazi camp, those kind of things. So for those reasons, he finds de Gaulle's determination to assert the dignity of what de Gaulle conceives as being France a bit exasperating. And there's certainly moments in 42, 43 when relations between them are very bad. And you get all these famous Churchillian witticisms about, de Gaulle having all the stiffness of a poker without its occasional warmth and those kind of things.
I like the one, he thinks he's Joan of Arc, but I can't get my bloody bishops to burn him.
Indeed,
I thought
of course, the key thing is Churchill admires Joan of Arc fantastically, so it's a rather double-edged remark.
What does de Gaulle think of Churchill? Does he, I mean, it sounds an absurd thing to say about Winston Churchill, but does he find him rather silly?
At times he does. He appreciates Churchill. So the great phrase he uses about Churchill is, he says, an artist of history. It's a phrase he might equally well have used about himself. So he appreciates the kind of drama of Churchill's kind of construction of himself, construction of Britain, all those things. There are certainly moments when de Gaulle finds Churchill a bit silly. Above all, Churchill admires de Gaulle because he's a romantic. But de Gaulle himself is not a romantic, and he doesn't like Churchill's romanticised view of the world. There's a wonderful moment. Churchill sends de Gaulle a passage from his memoir, or from his history of the Second World War, to comment on, in which Churchill describes de Gaulle's escape from France in 1940. And de Gaulle writes a kind of withering letter saying this is a Romanesque account, a romantic, a novel-like account. And that's obviously disapproval.
Look, I'm going to ask you about their early lives. I appreciate it's rather ridiculous to ask you to sort of sum up even Churchill alone's early life in the space of a minute or two, but I'm afraid that's all we're going to have for it. They were very, very different, their early lives. Tell us how.
Well, they're different, first of all, because Churchill is more or less born famous. He's the grandson of a duke, the son of a senior minister, and he goes on to make himself even more famous. So by the time he enters Parliament at the age of 25, and he's already well known as a writer and adventurer and so on and so forth. Whereas if de Gaulle had been killed in the First World War, which of course very likely for an infantry officer in the French army to be killed in the First World War, we'd never have heard of him.
Right.
And in fact, most people have never heard of de Gaulle until 1940. Most French people, when he starts broadcasting on the BBC, say, "Who is this man?"
Right. And how crucial was their relationship towards winning the war? Had there been a different Frenchman in exile in London, would it have been dramatically different?
I think the answer is that the actual outcome of the war wouldn't have been very different. I mean, de Gaulle has very few troops under his command, even later in the war when he begins to rally people from North Africa and so on. And obviously, overwhelmingly, the Second World War is won by the United States, which I think both de Gaulle and Churchill know. The outcome of the war in terms of France being defined as a victor power and having all those things like a seat on the UN Security Council, which obviously derives from being recognised as victor power, those derive very much from de Gaulle's stance. And then de Gaulle, much more than Churchill, is the man of the post-war. So in lots of ways, Churchill's a terribly sad figure when he becomes Prime Minister again in 1951. He's too old. He doesn't understand the post-war world, really. His own associates, I think, regard this as a tragic period often, whereas de Gaulle's greatest period is actually when he comes back to power after 1958, when he's really kind of remodelling France and creating the kind of modern France we know now.
Tell us a bit about how he was seen in France, because I think people probably broadly, most people will broadly, at least broadly, know the sort of the trajectory of Churchill in British public esteem. The fact that he lost the election after the war, came back, as you say, was seen as a bit disappointed, kind of sort of faded away, and yet is venerated as this sort of totemic British hero today. How does de Gaulle's trajectory compare to that?
Well, its trajectory, as I say, takes him from being unknown. Also, the thing you've got to remember about de Gaulle is that for large periods of his life, large groups of people, especially, in fact, on the extreme right of French politics, hate him.
As per Dave the Jackal.
Exactly.
Yes.
I mean, he's a man almost defined by assassination attempts in the early 60s, and in a strange way, that very much contributes to his image. So Churchill in the early 60s has become this figure, Private Eye, this famous cruel phrase, the greatest dying Englishman. Churchill is gradually kind of fading out. Meanwhile, de Gaulle is facing, blokes trying to machine gun his car all the time, from which he always emerges kind of completely unperturbed, this utterly cold self-control he has. So that actually de Gaulle, for a long time, is very strongly defined by emotions against him and becomes a more consensual figure really after his death.
Right, okay. And with Churchill's sort of early career having been deeply steeped in colonialism, one could, I suppose, say that de Gaulle's later career was, because he had everything going on in North Africa. Tell us a bit about that. Well,
he becomes a kind of imperialist during the Second World War because he draws a lot of his support, a lot of his troops from first sub-Saharan Africa and then eventually North Africa, especially Algeria. So that becomes important to him. I don't think he's ever an imperialist in the way that Churchill is. Metropolitan France is what matters to de Gaulle. The Franco-German conflict is what matters to de Gaulle. And also de Gaulle has a very, very abstract idea of France, which means in a way he's very flexible. The famous opening phrase of his memoirs, a certain idea of France. And an idea of France is not, of course, a very concrete thing. So it allows him to change over time. And the big change is when he comes to power in 1958, people think he's come to power to keep French Algeria. In fact, 4 years later, the French leave Algeria, and which is one of the things that makes people, as in the Day of the Jackal, so hostile to him. But also, of course, it's a spectacular transition, which then facilitates all sorts of other ways in which France changes. It's very hard to imagine the period of the rapid growth of the Trente Glorieuses and the modernisation of France if she'd stayed in Algeria and if she'd remained in imperial power.
Well, look, I'm afraid we're just about out of time, but a sort of one-word answer. Do you see Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer being figures of the same stature remembered by history?
I I think the cruel answer to that is Keir Starmer definitely not. There's a touch of de Gaulle in Macron.
That's fascinating. Look, Richard Vinen, thank you so much. Great to have you here. The book is The Last Titans, Churchill and de Gaulle.